This is NBC 10 News.
New at 4, Scoop and Run.
They just made that move immediately, picked me up, and got me in the car.
The NBC 10 investigators introduce you to the heroes behind the healing.
We'll always have that bond together. It's something we'll never forget.
And piece together an unexpected trend, saving lives on Philly streets.
For months now, the NBC 10 investigators have been digging into a police tactic that is distinctly Philadelphia. Officers rushing trauma victims to the hospital themselves rather than waiting for an ambulance.
Investigative reporter George Spencer found those so-called scoop and runs are on the rise, and he introduces us to one man whose life has been forever changed.
You hear the order to scoop as this SEPTA police body camera spins around, and then the rush. Officers spring into action, loading this shooting victim into a cruiser and leaving for the hospital before an ambulance ever gets on scene.
So this was the house where we had the party at.
On this North Philly block 8 years ago, Ian Hurst Hermans was a shooting victim also.
He pulls a pistol out of his jacket and just fired one shot.
Lying on the street, the young man, then a Temple Jr., was bleeding profusely. But he still remembers the arrival of the officers who would save his life.
It only took them, 2 or 3 seconds to decide what to do.
You all knew you had to scoop him the moment you saw him.
Yes. Yeah. For the first time ever, officers James Bryan and Michael Goods spoke to us about that quick decision.
He was white as a piece of paper. He had lost so much blood.
The longtime partners knew their shooting victim was near death.
And I don't even think there were words. We just went down, we grabbed them, threw them in the car, and we got going.
As it turns out, that speed of transport likely saved Ian's life.
Time is life.
Dr. Jeremy Cannon, trauma medical director at the University of Pennsylvania, says he sees scoop and run shooting victims almost nightly, and believes many of them survive simply because they get to the hospital so quickly.
That's the life-saving element, is reducing the time that the patient has to bleed to death.
The Philadelphia Police Department requires officers to scoop victims as soon as a shooting scene is secured, but it doesn't track how many scoops its officers do. So we partnered with the nonprofit journalism organization The Trace and went to the Pennsylvania Trauma Systems Foundation for their data. We discovered the number of scoop and runs has nearly doubled over the past decade, from 218 in 2008 to more than 400 last year, an average of more than 1 per day, even as the total number of gunshot victims has stayed flat or even declined.
Philadelphia police do it every day. Every time there's a shooting, the first person on scene usually does the scooping.
The officers who saved Ian tell us scoop and runs are a proud part of the Philly police tradition, even though the practice is almost unheard of outside the Philadelphia region.
Is there ever a piece of you that feels like this isn't in my job description?
No, never. It's instinct. We want to preserve life.
For Ian, the decision to scoop him feels more personal.
Officer Good and Officer Bryan.
You tattooed their names.
Right.
The officers' names forever written on his chest, their rush to get him to the hospital seared into his memory.
They 100% saved my life, man. Yeah, without that decision, without that quick decision, and without the execution of their decision, I 100% wouldn't be here today.
And Ian still keeps in contact with the officers who scooped him. Doctors say he probably only had 1 or 2 minutes before he would have bled to death that night. So the quick transportation, getting him to the hospital, was absolutely essential. Jacqueline and Aaron.
He really owes his life to those officers, and then having it inked on him forever as a permanent memory. That story is such a powerful example, and most other police departments don't do this scoop and run.
Yeah, Jacqueline and Aaron, as we dug into this, we found the practice of these police transports to the hospital, they are very uncommon. So coming up at 5 o'clock in our 5 o'clock news, we're taking a look, kind of piecing together the big picture to see just how rare it is, and also introducing you to some of the agencies that are taking a lead from Philly.
So fascinating. All right.
It is powerful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see you next hour, George.
Yeah, thank you.
In Philadelphia, more and more shooting victims are being transported to the hospital by police officers rather than EMTs. For many, that speedy transport means the difference between life and death.
So this is seen as something that is distinctly Philadelphia, but NBC 10 investigative reporter George Spencer found out that the tactic is being used also on the other side of the Delaware River.
Amid the frightened shouts of bystanders, this SEPTA police body cam video captures 5 officers scooping up an injured shooting victim and loading him into a police van to be rushed to the hospital.
It was sharp and fast.
5 years ago, Gregory Cunningham was shot in North Philadelphia and scooped in much the same way.
And then next thing I remember, that's when the cops was picking me up.
The scoop and run is a well-known local practice, but few other police agencies use it so extensively. In partnership with the nonprofit journalism organization The Trace, we reached out to more than a dozen PDs with the highest homicide rates. About half tell us their officers never scoop shooting victims. Mostly, they say, because their officers aren't trained and don't have the medical equipment of EMTs. The other half say they do it only rarely, under the most unique or extreme circumstances, like when an officer is shot.
Most of your police departments do not engage in this type of policy.
Chief Scott Thompson leads one of the other departments that does do it, just across the river in Camden. He says he took a direct lead from Philly police just 3 years ago.
In the car.
And worked with Dr. John Porter, head of trauma at Cooper University Hospital, to mesh medical routines with the new tactic.
While they're scooping and running, their dispatch is actually calling to the trauma center so that I'm there waiting when they show up.
This body camera video shows SEPTA police officers scooping a man who'd been shot in the leg.
I need a key, I need a key.
Like its counterparts in Philly and Camden,
Yo, keep talking, bro.
The transit agency's police force also employs the tactic when officers beat EMTs to the scene of a penetrating injury. For Camden, Chief Thompson says the scoop and run practice has been transformative as the department worked to overhaul its image and approach.
When we say that your life matters and we're willing to employ this type of policy, it really resonates within the community.
For the investigators, George Spencer, NBC 10 News.
And Camden's chief says his officers transport about 1 out of every 5 shooting and stabbing victims. The city's murder rate is currently nearly 50-year low, and the chief believes all those life-saving scoops are contributing to the lower homicide count.
New tonight, scoop and run, saving lives.
There was just no chance that I would have made it.
The NBC 10 investigators uncover unexpected growth in a Philly police tradition.
Why do you think the numbers are on the rise?
And reveal the outside trends that may be contributing to the change.
Philadelphia police are transporting more and more shooting victims to the hospital themselves rather than waiting for an ambulance.
It is a distinctively Philly practice known as a scoop and run, but we wanted to know why those numbers are climbing.
So investigative reporter George Spencer asked the captain of one police district where many of those scoops occur.
SEPTA police body cam video shows this officer rushing towards the flashing lights where you can listen to it happening. The fast-thinking decision by police to scoop this shooting victim and rush him to the hospital themselves.
Probably about probably right here.
For Ian Hurst Hermans, shot on this North Philly block 8 years ago,
he pulls a pistol out.
His scoop likely meant the difference between life and death because his ride in the back of a police car got him to the ER so quickly.
If I was shot in pretty much any other major city, then I would be dead.
He might be right. In partnership with the nonprofit journalism organization The Trace, we reached out to more than a dozen PDs with the highest homicide rates and found that none of them use scoop and runs as routinely as Philly.
How did this practice develop in Philly?
It's always been something as long as I've been here.
Captain Stephen Clark of the 24th District tells us scoops have been a part of the Philadelphia police culture for so long, most officers can't imagine it any other way.
We got a little concerned there.
Clark says Philly cops get basic training about protecting themselves during scoops, but other than that, it's simple instinct.
And that's always been the predominant mindset of this department, is to save lives. Like, we don't join the police department to watch people die.
Dr. Jeremy Cannon of the University of Pennsylvania believes many lives are saved. No special training needed.
I'm very positive about the scoop and run practice here in Philadelphia. I think it gets patients quickly to the definitive treatment that they need.
But the lingering question is why the number of scoop and runs here have nearly doubled over the past 10 years to an average of more than one a day, even as the number of shooting victims has held relatively constant or even dipped. One possible explanation may be EMS response times. The fire department's numbers show EMS arrives to calls within 9 minutes only 65% of the time, well below their own goal of 90% of the time. Clark acknowledges that police usually arrive faster to shooting scenes than EMS, saying there are far more officers on the streets than ambulances.
It could be a 10-minute gap.
10-minute gap.
5 to 10 minutes.
So that's significant.
That's significant.
In an interview with The Trace, Fire Commissioner Adam Thiel says everything helps, including police scoop and runs. He says the 55 ambulances on Philly streets at any given time are weighed down with nearly 300,000 EMS incidents each year.
It's a busy location, though.
But Clark believes the increase actually has a simpler cause. He says officers are simply scooping more people with more minor injuries because they've seen how effective the practice is. So what, it's Officer Good
and Officer Bryant.
For Hurst Hermans, the names of the officers who scooped him are tattooed on his chest. The body art is his reminder of a distinctly Philly practice that forever changed him.
They're my guys, man. They're my heroes, and this way, at least a little bit, I can take them with me where I am.
For the investigators, George Spencer, NBC 10 News.
And we reached out to both the police and fire unions in Philadelphia to get their perspective on the scoop and run practice, but the unions declined to comment for our story.